Hello and welcome to the seventh episode of the Nations of Charlemagne, France, the House of Capet. Very lucky as always to be joined by Columba. Hello, sir.
Hello, good to be here.
Very sorry to say that Marcus Pertinax is sadly ill, so he won't be able to join us for this episode. But hopefully he'll be back on form next week when we talk about the Great Interregnum and German history. So just to give people a quick introduction to this period and what we're going to cover today. From the reign of Charlemagne, we have the apogee of French dynastic royal power, where France controls, or the French dynasty, the Carolingians, control modern-day France, with the exception of Brittany. They control Barcelona, they control Catalonia, they control northern Italy, they control modern-day Germany, they control the Benelux region, and essentially all of Western Christendom is united under the principal ruler of Charlemagne. However, the Carolingian dynasty has a very short life. It collapses very quickly after the death of Charlemagne. First, under the reign of Louis the Pious, you have the general erasure of royal authority. And throughout the 9th century, you see Carolingian kings being reduced very much to the position of the Merovingian kings that had preceded them under the Frankish Empire. So this is where we get the arrival of the House of Capet, which will rise from relative obscurity, become kings of France, start off with a tiny royal domain, and begin a very long process of expansion of royal power through the 11th and the 12th centuries, culminating in the reign of Philip II, who will conquer most of the then English possessions of the Angevin-Plantagenet Empire. And during the 13th century, we see the apogee of the Capetian kings under Saint Louis IX and the beginning of the decline of the Capetian house with the reign of Philip IV and all of the interesting things going on there, which will be the end of the discussion and the lead on to the next discussion of France, episode 10, which will be focusing on the 100 Years' War. So without further ado, we'll get started. And I think, if it's all right, Columba, I think a good topic to start this conversation is talking about the Vikings, who were a perpetual menace to the West Franks during the 9th and the 10th centuries. Before I start off on the chronology, is there any thing you want to say about the Vikings?
The Vikings in this period, I mean, I'm not an expert. I only know that they were an absolute scourge pretty much across the North Sea at this time. You know, they were raiding England, and they were raiding the east coast of Scotland as well at this time. They were sort of hitting the apogee of their power in terms of exploration and trade and what have you. And so yeah, I mean, I couldn't speak in massive detail about them, but I know that they were a real thorn in the side of pretty much everyone in this period.
I mean, to put this perspective, not only, obviously originating from Scandinavia, not only had they attacked and raided the coast of England at this time, we're talking the beginning of the 9th century. Not only had they attacked Charlemagne's empire in the north, not only had they been raiding France, they had also arrived in the Eastern Roman Empire as well, where they eventually become the Varangians, and they had also invaded Russia, and they'd also reached Greenland, and they'd also
Yes,
founded
yes, they got about. They got about.
yes, the first American European colony in Vinland. So they were definitely unparalleled naval explorers at the time, and this is where we get to the beginning of the story when we get onto the French story. Viking raids tended to go along the Seine River and go up it and raid the city of Paris. And this began around the 820s. In 845, Paris itself is sacked by the Vikings. And in return, the then emperor of the Carolingian Empire, king of West Francia, who would later become emperor, Charles II, Charles the Bald, is forced to pay the Vikings £7,000 of silver. And of course, anyone who's familiar with English history, this is a very common theme. The Vikings aren't expanding for the sake of territory. In most exceptions, they're wanting to pillage and take vast amounts of tribute. And so this is essentially the modus operandi of the Vikings in France during this time. So getting on to the origin of where we get the House of Capet. The House of Capet had an ancestor dynasty known as the Robertians. Now, it's, again, very debated where the actual origins of the Robertian dynasty, where they actually came from. But the first major historical figure we have is Robert the Strong, Margrave of Neustria. the Count of Mine of Anjou, and the Palace Inspector. So basically seeing a very similar situation with the Carolingians and the Merovingians before them, where the Palace Inspector, or the Major Domo, becomes the power behind the throne, or the grey eminence of the kingdom, so to speak.
Yes.
And this
And we
happens
see
very early on.
yes, and don't we see that sort of after they get this status, because of course at this point with the Carolingians and the prestige attached to the line with Charlemagne and what have you, you know, all ideas of elective monarchy have sort of gone out the window, right? And you've had succession amongst the family, and now you see a push to return to the earlier elective system to get the Robertians into power.
Well, principally because the Carolingians were so useless in confronting the military threat,
Yes.
which was posed by the Vikings. So to put this in perspective, Salomon of Brittany, of course, is brought into brief sort of tutelage under the West Frankian kings during this period. The Britons and Robert the Strong form a alliance. And first of all, they rebel against the original Carolingian authority under Charles II. But then it will be Robert the Strong who will be defending France against the Vikings at the Battle of Brizard in 866, where he will die. And he is really considered, again, to be the founder of the Robertian dynasty, which is the ancestor. In terms of, again, where does Robert come from? Robert is commonly assumed to have come from Worms, which, of course, is would later become one of the most important imperial cities in Germany. So there is definitely an imperial connection, especially with Hugh Capet later on. But the origin of the dynasty obviously happens in creating this, you can say, the strong dynastic holding in Neustria, in Maine, in Anjou, and establishing a reputation for defeating the Viking invaders when the own imperial authority, or the Carolingian authority, was completely absent and failed to do so. So
and we're still in this and we're still in a period here, it's still relatively early, relatively I don't know, I suppose barbarous, I could use that word, where ideas of lineage and the sacrality of a king's line can go out of the window very quickly if you can't win battles.
Yes, when the need arises and desperate times call for desperate measures. So Robert the Strong dies in 866 at the Battle of Brizard, and he is succeeded by two sons, Odo and Robert. And Odo eventually becomes, after a brief hassle over his inheritance, he becomes the Count of Paris. And this establishes the Capetian dynasty later on, the Robertians and the Capetians, as controlling this domain around Paris, which will eventually evolve into the Ile-de-France, the Isle of France, which will become the royal domain, which will expand across, eventually encompass the entire country. So really, in terms of, again, the apogee of the beginning of the decline of the Carolingian dynasty, you mentioned how the idea of, sacred monarchy, because of course the dynasty was officiated over by the Pope as, having this regal Roman quality to it. The last emperor, Carolingian emperor, to hold all of these domains I mentioned in the form of a single person was Charles the Fat. He would briefly, inherit the domains in 884, and from that point on, from 884 onwards, he would basically do nothing. I mean, less the fat, more the lethargic, I think, is more appropriate name for
well,
for
they seem
Charles.
to go hand in hand, don't they?
Yes, even though we do have these wonderfully descriptive names of the early Carolingian monarchs during this time. He's infamous for, as you can see here in the middle, we have the painting of Odo defeating the Vikings at the siege of Paris. Now, the siege of Paris is virtually unknown in the English-speaking world, but after the original sack of Paris in 845, in 885, the Vikings came with a vast army. We're talking potentially between 20 and 40,000 men and 300 and 700 ships to not only raid the city of Paris, but go along the Seine and basically pillage the entire interior of France. Of course, the Seine Valley being the largest sort of center of French urban dwelling, so to speak, at this point. Yes. And the incredible thing about this is that Odo only has a couple of hundred men of arms to defend the city, and he's able to successfully hold on to the city against this massive invasion force against the Vikings, who are considered, the most fearsome military scourge across Europe during this time.
The terror of Christendom, yeah.
And defend it against this vast Viking force. When the imperial forces of Charles the Fat do arrive, rather than do anything, they simply permit the Vikings to not engage with the forces, go along the Seine and loot cities further down the river. And Charles the Fat then even pays them tribute for the privilege of having just left Paris alone after this
strong leadership,
epic siege. So quite rightly, you can say, after this shameful display by the Emperor of the Franks, the successor of Charlemagne, the last ruler of all the three united kingdoms of the empire, he is rightly deposed, and this is where we have the creation of not only the dynasty that later bequeathed the Holy Roman Empire in the east, but we have the rise of the Robertians. So in the east, in East Francia,
Henry the Fowler and.
Yeah, well, that's slightly later. Arnulf of Carinthia, one of an illegitimate Carolingian, would take over, and his son would briefly try and claim the imperial dignity, and would eventually be replaced by Conrad, Henry the Fowler, and ultimately the Ottonian dynasty, which will bequeath, the Holy Roman Empire in 962. In 888. Count Odo of Paris, after this impressive military display against the Vikings, is elected for his military prowess as the first king of the House of Robert the Strong. And his raison d'etre on becoming king is, I'm going to defeat the Vikings. I'm going to drive them out of France. They've begun settling in what would later become Normandy, and of course they were using this as staging posts to invade and penetrate the interior of France. So Odo resolved to eliminate this military threat, and yet there are also Carolingians during this time. I mean, the Carolingian dynasty hasn't been extinguished, even though it's been temporarily removed from power due to the single incompetence of Charles the Fat. Yes, exactly.
Don't you get another couple of Carolingian kings and then another Robertian king, and it sort of switches in and out briefly?
You can basically say it's kind of like a low-key dynastic war throughout from 888 until 987. There is constant switches between the royal dynasty, depending on, you can say, the rightful royal house, which are the Carolingians, and the more military successful and more politically savvy Robertians and later Capetians.
And it's an exact parallel of what happened with the Merovingians and the Carolingians.
Yes,
it was Charles Martel.
Yes, it's interesting how these patterns do repeat themselves, where we do have the weaker older dynasty being supplanted by the more militarily active dynasty, and again the same thing again is happening now to the Carolingians, now it's the Robertians. So again, as I mentioned, because the Carolingians aren't around, Odo is frustrated in his attempts to drive the Vikings out of France, because many of the Frankish nobles worry about having a strong militaristic French king ally around the child who would later become known as Charles the Simple. Again, a wonderfully
but I believe simple at this time was actually more of a compliment, was it not?
Oh yes, one interpretation is that it means child the straightforward.
Yeah, so straight talking.
Yes, but in terms of posterity, Charles the Simple has meant Charles the Incompetent or Charles the Buffoon, because he basically, within French historical sources, he goes down as the idiot king who had to be imprisoned because of his numerous incompetences multiple times. He doesn't get imprisoned once; he gets imprisoned multiple times and deposed and attempted restoration. And like I said, this attempt to restore the Carolingians actually frustrates the attempts of the Robertians to launch this military campaign against the Vikings. And so from 888 until 898, Odo is really fighting a civil war as well as a war with the Vikings. To make matters worse, we also have to consider the East Franks at this time under Arnulf of Carinthia, who are also wanting to expand their influence over the kingdom. And so they're more than happy to pit one of these rivals against the other to ensure there isn't a strong power to the west that can challenge what would later become the Ottonian authority in the east.
Yeah. Because of course, I assume that at the back of everybody's minds is the possibility of trying to, acquire the other kingdoms, reunite, and assert a sort of total control over the empire, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, the empire had only, in terms of
it's in memory.
Yes, it come to an end in 887, but it had been disunited and reunited before. So the idea that the empire could be united again, is definitely not beyond beyond the question at this point. But obviously, it wasn't going to happen under the Carolingian ruler in West Francia, Charles the Simple. In terms of his, again, incompetent military record, rather than going against the Vikings as Odo wanted, he decides to form basically a treaty with the Vikings. And as you can see on the picture on the right here, we have the first Count of Rouen, which would later be known as the Duke of Normandy, won Rollo. And
Yes,
after
and he was the first to sort of cut a deal and establish a feudal right to the land, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, he does this again through basically a military conquest, which is basically confirmed by the French king as really a feudal investment, but really it's a military conquest and the creation of a Viking domain in France. And this happens after the Battle of Chartres in 911, where we have the Charles the Simple negotiating with Rollo. And through the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sous-Epte, we have the creation of what would later become the Duchy of Normandy with all of its territories. In terms of like what this represented, in return for the Vikings' loyalty, we're talking all the land between the River Epte and of course the sea. And also the Duchy of Brittany was at various times, considered part of the Norman patrimony, and later William the Conqueror would try and invade and conquer Brittany as well. But it's quite interesting because it doesn't just coincide with the Normans conquering a territory and the French recognizing it, and as an about face recognizing him as a feudal fief of the Kingdom of France. Rollo also agrees to baptize, to be baptized, to convert to Christianity. So of course the Vikings were pagans at this point, Norse pagans, and so the Norsemen under the control of Rollo agree to convert, and they also agree to defend the north against other Vikings as well. So these are converted Francophone Vikings defeating other Vikings for the protection of the royal domain in the Ile-de-France.
Sure. And again, pointing out these funny patterns, it's really strange that in this area, sort of Normandy, and then to the northeast of Normandy, that sort of region, Northern Europe, also extending up into the Netherlands, we've covered on multiple shows this pattern that we see of these northern highly militaristic groups coming in and being settled around that sort of area by the power that would be. And of course, the ironic thing is that now we have the kings of France granting the Normans land, whereas if we go back to the 5th century and the time of the Franks, the exact same thing happened.
Yes, even before. I mean, this started with
and the Batavians
and the Salian Franks. So
it's got a long history.
Yes, it goes back a long time. So just another you could say creation of a French federati in the form of the Vikings, later the Normans. So what would happen, just to give a quick overview of the Duchy of Normandy, Rollo and the Viking settlers in the north would assimilate with the local population. However, there are areas such as the area around Cherbourg in northern Brittany, which were almost entirely made up of Norsemen settlers. And these areas would take a very long time to actually assimilate in any sense of French identity. And this is why we have the creation of what you can say is a sense of Norman identity as opposed to French identity, this assimilation of the Norse culture and the Gallo-Roman culture at the same time. And you could say this was a conscious attempt by the dukes to establish this idea. I mean, in theory, Richard I creates the feudal settlement in Normandy, and Richard II is supposedly supposed to have invented the term Norman and Normandy, so to give a name for this territory and to give a sense, like I said, of nationality. What also was important to note at this time is that Richard II's sister would go on, Emma of Normandy, would go on to marry Ethelred the Unready, whose son would be Edward the Confessor. And this would be the tenuous claim to the throne which William the Bastard, later William the Conqueror, would use when he goes,
or William the Mamser, depending on how based you are, I suppose. I don't hear that term tossed around a lot these days.
No, I think, again, William the Bastard and William the Conqueror are both also very appropriate. William, of course, having been, the bastard son of his father. So getting back to France, because obviously what will happen with the Norman invasion, later, and the English rivalry with the English will become paramount in this story. But going back to France, again, talking about English-French similarities, Charles the Simple alienated many of his nobles due to a certain excessive favoritism with a petty noble known as Higano. And this meant, investing in vast amounts of territory and giving him, unparalleled access to the royal person and, to council. And I can't help but feel that this is almost exactly what happened in England with Piers Gaveston and Edward II, who
well, perhaps not the exact same situation. I don't know.
Why not?
I mean,
why not?
Were they that close? I mean, they are French, so.
well, so virtually were the English kings at that under Edward II as well.
Well, yeah, I suppose.
So
I mean, it's not impossible. I'll tell you what, though, if it was true, they would have kept it quiet.
So I think there certainly are parallels between that, and of course this resulted in the nobility, who again have been shut out of access to the king, and of course the nobles prided themselves on access to the king, their ability to influence the king, and the idea that a lesser noble would have this exclusive access to the king, as in the case of Piers Gaveston, was an affront to them, in addition to the fact that the policies of Charles the Simple were disastrous. Essentially, he'd been able to recoup Lotharingia, the area of the Benelux and Lorraine, which covered, between East Francia and West Francia. And due to his failure to hold on to this territory, throughout his reign, he would lose influence over it due to thanks to the Franks and Henry the Fowler. And after his reign, Lotharingia will be lost, decisively to the French, forever. And as a result, West Francia would hold on to its legal territory in terms of the boundaries you see all the way up until really the end of this period, much diminished compared to the Holy Roman Empire in the East, which would hold on to all of the other possessions of the former Carolingian Empire. And so in response to this, kind of again like what happened with Edward II, Charles the Simple is imprisoned by his nobles, and this leads to basically a succession war, who is going to take over from this militarily incompetent king. And this is where we get the arrival of King Odo's brother Robert, another son of Robert the Strong, who briefly is elected king, only to be quickly dispatched by supporters of Charles at the Battle of Soissons. So again, we see another Robertian replacing another Carolingian at this time, but again, unable to capitalize and establish a dynasty, which will, ultimately be created by Hugh Capet.
And that's, and the reason for that is because it's so hard in this chaos to establish a sort of proper base of power. It's extremely difficult to the system is I mean, there barely is much of an administrative system that actually is set up during the time that we're speaking about over these centuries. So yeah, it's just a raw fight for power, and it's extremely difficult because all of the nobles think that they're worthy of a shot, basically.
Yes, and what you say is basically correct. I mean, in many ways, having the throne is a bit of a liability because all of the nobles are aspiring to it, and actually being a quiet noble behind the scenes working to expand your power base without anyone noticing is a much more effective policy. And this will actually be executed by one of the Robertians. So after we have the death of Odo, Hugh, who is the death of Robert, Hugh, who is the son of Robert, is actually offered the throne, and he decides, no, I'm not going to take the throne. It's too much of a risk to myself.
That's how you know it's a bad time when someone will turn down the crown.
Charles is still alive, even though Charles will eventually be captured again and locked up in a monastery when he'll die in 929. Obviously, you don't want to take power when it'll precipitate another civil war. So he allows his son-in-law, the Bivanid Rudolph of Burgundy, to take over basically as a caretaker king for a decade or so. And it's during this time that Hugh is basically the kingmaker behind West Francia before we get to
he accrues all sorts of titles, doesn't he, like the Duke of the Franks and what have you.
Yes, the Duke of the Franks is the most prominent title, and after again consolidating the possessions in Neustria, the former Frankish kingdom, and establishing his presence in Paris, in 936 Rudolph dies, and he makes the you can again say the interesting choice of inviting an exiled Carolingian, Louis IV,
a very risky choice.
son of Charles the Simple, to come and inherit the throne. So basically, I'm not going to take the throne either. I'm going to take this puppet king and I'm going to put him on the throne whilst, I basically dominate the kingdom. And in return for this, as you say, Hugh is granted the title Duke of the Franks, basically, putting him on par as the primus inter pares of all the nobility in France.
Yes, I think there's a quote from the time by a sort of monk or a bishop who recorded the time, and he says that I think it was Louis, right? Louis was king in name basically, but
Louis the Fourth.
Louis the Fourth, yeah, and Hugh was just running everything. He was in command of the army. He was in command of the administration, and the king would publish sort of statements to his nobles and stuff, saying, this is the man in whom I confide. This is the second man in my realm, and things like this. And so, it was very clear who was in charge.
But the issue, of course, is that whenever you install a puppet king, inevitably that puppet king will want to take over and resent being controlled by a noble. So
yes, wasn't Louis the Fourth quite young?
Yes, Louis the Fourth. Again, you bring in a child king in the hope that you basically acted like a foster parent, and then you become the controlling influence when he reaches maturity. But inevitably, in so many cases in history, it's so many to list, when a king reaches his maturity, often he proves to be more trouble than he's worth, and many times it results in his death. It doesn't result in Louis IV's death. It just results in an awkward situation throughout the 940s, where Louis is trying to hold on to the last vestige of royal power, whilst Hugh is, again, like I said, expanding this royal domain at this point, noble domain around the Ile-de-France. But nevertheless, when we have the death of the young King Louis, we have his son, another young king, Lothar, who comes in, and in the same manner to Louis IV, Hugh is instrumental in bringing this king into power and ensuring that he
and didn't Louis IV die in a hunting accident or something?
Yes,
of that
allegedly.
There are a lot of hunting accidents at this time.
Yes, Louis V also died in a hunting accident. There are a lot of hunting accidents during this period, just completely coincidentally. We're not insinuating anything.
No, wouldn't dream of it.
No. Lothar becomes king, and in return for the smooth succession, Hugh is, granted the titles of Duke of Aquitaine and Duke of Burgundy, just coincidentally for ensuring the succession. But as with everything else, Hugh, dies in 958 as one of the most powerful men in France. But nevertheless, when he's succeeded by his son to his title of Duke of the Franks, Hugh Capet. Capet, of course, just being a nickname, but it would later, because Hugh Capet establishes the definitive dynasty without interruption, the House of Capet, all the Capetians, will become the dynasty which carries on, all the way up until, you could say,
Citizen Capet, yeah.
Yes, Le Roi Citoyen with Louis Philippe. But yes, but Hugh Capet, it seems at the beginning that he might actually, lose his authority at the expense of Lothar, because like Louis, he tries to expand his authority. More than that, he tries to expand it at the expense of the Ottonian dynasty. He launches a raid into Lotharingia. He tries to seize all these territories, which the now Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great has just consolidated.
And this is because at this time, many of the popes who are sort of, we have a very corrupt papacy. We have the Theophylacti and all these weird families, but many of them at this point are under the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so we begin to see, I don't know if you'd agree, but this is when we begin to really see the friction between the kings of France or the Capetians and the church.
Yes, I think what's interesting is that obviously the Bishop of Reims is one of the most powerful religious leaders in France during this time, is that we have the religious institutions in France actually begin to switch their allegiance away from the Carolingians and towards the House of Capet. And this is more or less coinciding with the interests of the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Holy Roman Empire, of course, during this time, if you go back and watch our stream, The Formation of the Holy Roman Empire, is ultimately under Emperor Otto reliant on the clergy to act as a administrative class, hence Holy Roman Empire, and why the empire would be so vulnerable in the investiture controversy.
But of course, like like what we see in the Holy Roman Empire, the picture is more complex because the situation in Italy is, of course, extremely unstable, even from the perspective of the church. And in France, there is this instability. There is this. There are churchmen who I suppose are more loyal to either the emperor or the pope, but there is a wide base of churchmen who are very loyal to the King of France. And at this point, I would say that the church in France is the most powerful church anywhere in the world because it's relatively stable. They can accrue power and influence and wealth in
Yeah,
a way that you don't see
ju-
elsewhere.
just to push back on that slightly, I think it's fair to say during the 10th and the 11th centuries that the German church is the most powerful church in Europe at this
Okay,
time, especially under the primate of the Archbishop of Mainz, who is
Mainz,
basically
yeah.
the most powerful religious figure you could say in the world at this point, in the Catholic world especially.
So you would
Well,
say it's only later, once we get to the 13th and 14th centuries,
yes,
that
yes,
shifts. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. When the church becomes, more divided. But certainly at this point, again, like I say, the church is divided in its loyalties, and I think it's also important to note that the king in West Francia is still using the term King of the Franks, King of France. Won't actually originate until later on when we have Philip II Augustus. So there is still
Yes.
this claim not only to this domain of West Francia, which will later become France, but the idea of the King of Franks as representing the entire inheritance of the Frankish Empire and the Carolingian
Yes.
Empire as well.
It's only when France as a nation state, if you will, or a proto nation state rather,
Mm,
becomes stronger that we get that differentiation, and it's no
yes,
longer
and
being the king of the
yes,
people, you are the king of France. Yeah.
yes,
And
it's the
I think that's also
differentiation.
I think that also coincides with an increasing influence through the church, but also just generally of the Latin population of France, because of course in the early centuries of Frankish domination, you'd had Frankish domination, Germanic domination, but we see people like the abbot. How do you pronounce it? Suger. How
Sujet.
do you say? Sujet? Sorry. We have people like this who come from Latin peasant backgrounds in many cases, and they rise up to become very powerful.
Absolutely. So just getting to Hugh Capet, as I mentioned, we have this conflict with the Holy Roman Empire, conflict with the Church, and this friction between the Robertians and the Carolingians. Lothar is again the last Carolingian to try and attempt to restore the empire, and he fails, and it results in a coalition under Otto coming to Paris to basically depose Lothar and place his treacherous brother, Charles of Lorraine, on the throne. However, this is aborted partly because the emperor realizes that Hugh Capet, by the way, is his nephew. It might just be simpler to wait for the Carolingian dynasty to extinguish themselves and for this branch, the House of Capet, with no claims on all of these other Carolingian inheritances, whether they be Lotharingia or East Francia or Italy, to come to the throne and therefore allow his Ottonian dynasty, to rule untrammeled, without any sort of contender for his legitimacy. So basically, Otto is resolved to allow the Carolingian dynasty to destroy itself and
Yes,
potentially allowing a Capetian to do it.
and I think part of this is there seems to be a sort of growing realization that the continued battling and infighting over the empire of Charlemagne, say, is costing more than it's worth, and so there's this idea of making sacrifices of territory so that you can have a stronger claim and more stability in your realm. And indeed, in the centuries that follow, we do see the establishment of European states and administrations in a way that hadn't happened before. I mean, you had it under Charlemagne, but of course it was a brief flourishing, and then it sort of collapsed again, right? And it's only really at this time and then the centuries that follow, this key period, that they are set in stone and they don't collapse away again.
Yes. So here we have the election of Hugh Capet. Lothar dies, and his son Louis V, the last Carolingian ruler, is again dies mysteriously and in another hunting accident at a very young age.
The woods are really dangerous.
And here we have again another setup for another episode of the Robertians v the Carolingians, because as with Charles the Simple and Robert and Odo, we have a Robertian king in the form of Hugh Capet against another Carolingian contender in the form of Charles the Rain. However, when Hugh Capet is elected, he is elected unanimously because Hugh Capet is able to make the convincing argument that Charles the Rain allied with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto to usurp the throne from his brother, and therefore his treason has barred him from all claim on the throne of West Francia. And with that flourish, the Carolingian dynasty is dispossessed, and when Charles the Rain dies in 993, that's the last effective attempt of any Carolingian to ever come back and exert any royal power or imperial power ever again.
Can I ask a question about Hugh Capet? Because I read somewhere in preparation for this that he himself had a very tenuous bit of Carolingian blood himself. But is that true, to your knowledge?
In terms of his Carolingian blood, I don't have a genealogy up, but I mean, in terms of his royal blood, I mean, he didn't need to worry because he was, he was directly related to the emperor, Emperor Otto the Great. So, and again, there is Carolingian blood, splashed everywhere a little bit. So yes, I do believe that he had Carolingian blood through his ancestors. But in terms of like male line Carolingian descent, absolutely not. This is a direct line of descent from Robert the Strong, which the Robertians giving forth into the Capetians, which from now on definitively will be the French royal dynasty, and the dynasties we see subsequently are still Capetian dynasties. They are just not, they're cadet branches rather than the main branch, which is going to die out in the beginning of the 14th century. So getting on to
and then you get the House of Valois and what have you, right?
Yes, the Capetian branches of Capet Valois, Capet Bourbon, and towards very late in the French history, we see the House of Orleans as well.
Yes.
So yes, getting to Hugh Capet, as you can see on this map on the left, despite the fact that the Capetians, Robertians were building up this power base, is still very small. I mean, the domain which Hugh Capet had, basically he was elected due to the largesse of the nobles. In theory, you could have just disunited the Kingdom of France and ruled all these various fiefdoms independently. The unity, however, as with East Francia, is maintained, and this titular king is established in the form of Hugh Capet. And as we said, with the title of the Count of Paris, he controls Paris, he controls Orleans, he controls Chartres, importantly, but he can't even really leave his own domain for the risk of safety. There's even the idea that he could be captured and sent to the Holy Roman Emperor as a prisoner, who would basically, rule his empire through there.
Yes, it's an extremely tenuous situation.
Yes, in terms of obviously, linguistically, France is very diverse. The language we now know as French is, very provincial to the area around the city of Paris itself. Even some of these languages, such as Occitan in the south or Breton in the west, aren't, or of course, Flemish in the north, aren't even mutually intelligible. Of course, we have various legal traditions, legal codes throughout all of these fiefdoms as well. We have the rise of the robber barons who will just seize various persons and demand ransom if they go into a different feudal territory, etc. So we see basically the collapse of a unified political structure, and we see just a nominal kingship in the form of Hugh Capet. But why Capet is significant is because, as I said, he establishes the original power base, he establishes the royal domain, and he establishes the dynasty. And from there, we have the foundation to build the Capetian dynasty, which, towards the 13th century will, rule over France.
But in order to,
just one sec, I'll just be back in a second.
I assume it might be internet troubles, our dear audience. Let me see. I wonder how much he's going to let me talk about architecture. Yes, but one thing that I would like to bring up for the listeners, I was going to mention this. Hugh Capet has a tough time, and so he's trying to. The Capetian dynasty are trying to establish their power, and it's this very tenuous situation. They don't have control of a lot of territories, and so it seems to me that what they did is made an alliance and strong relations with the church, a central pillar of their sort of strategy.
Yes, in
And
particular,
have
this
you
is
heard of the peace and truce of God?
yes, and I mean, one of these figures, as you say, there is an early alliance, and one of the figures, of course, is Adalberon of Reims, the Archbishop,
Yes.
who officiates over the election of Hugh Capet. So yes, this election, coinciding with the switch of allegiance from the High Church, the High Church bishops to the House of Capet, and as I said, this also coincides with the imperial house, condoning the election of Hugh Capet. All of these complex political facets all coinciding to allow for the election of Hugh Capet.
Yes, and then we have the Council of Charroux, which is in the 980s, I think, the late 900s, and it's a council mostly of French churchmen that is sort of designed to push this idea of the peace and truce of God, reconciliation, the end of this, or the minimization of the feudal infighting that plagued the kingdom for so long. And I assume this was sponsored by the Capetian kings at the time, and so. As a result of that, we see the importance of churchmen grow and the wealth and power of the church grow as well, until by the time you get to the 12th century, things are really taking off.
Yes, the important development here, which you're probably well versed on, Columba, is the emergence of the Cluniac reform movement as well. Would you like to go into that? Because, of course, this is the 10th century we're talking about.
Well, I know that it was started by the Duke of Aquitaine. It was William the First, I think, and the Cluniacs were basically it was kind of a sort of I don't want to say romantic movement, but it was a reform movement within the church designed to I think it brought in all. It was designed to encourage art, and it was also designed to encourage you had reforms in monastic practice. I believe they brought in new rules about what you could eat in monasteries and what have you. But I think the system was also to some extent open to abuse, from what I've read, because as a part of this sort of Cluniac system, or actually no, I think the Cluniac system was a reaction to this, because what you had is a situation whereby a nobleman or some lord would build a church or build an abbey, for some monks, and then he would expect, because I've built this, all of the profits going to come to me. If I retire and I want somewhere to live in ease, I can live here. They even had sort of exceptional rules for sons of the nobility, where the rules for living in an abbey, about eating meat and drinking, these rules would be relaxed. And so I think the Cluniac movement actually came about as a reaction to this. And the reason is the Abbey of Cluny. I can't remember the exact details, but I think because of the actions of William of Aquitaine, he had basically given the Abbey of Cluny a free hand, right? It didn't have any noble control. And so then what you see happening is that in order to evade this noble control and this constant raiding and the avarice of the nobles, you get loads of sister abbeys of the Abbey of Cluny set up all over France. And I think there were over 1,000 of them. And the reason for this seems to be that if they were a sister of the Abbey of Cluny, then the same rules applied. And so it's really here in these early churches in the Cluniac movement, because of these sorts of reforms, that you do get a buildup of wealth in a large way, because it's a far more stable situation than that of the nobles. And of course, this begins to be expressed in the wonderful architecture. I mean, beginning with the Romanesque, obviously, which also for reasons which still confuse me, is very strongly associated with the Normans. And the Normans, as you say, I mean, they've not been here for very long at all. Not that long ago, they were pagan savages, Viking raiders. But when we see the kind of Romanesque architecture that comes out in the north, and then also slightly later in the 1000s in England, it's fantastic, and there's not been anything like it before. I mean, you have these fantastic vaulted ceilings and barrel vaulted ceilings which some people put down actually to the sort of Norman and northern expertise in shipbuilding, things like this, hall building, which, to be honest with you, seems like a perfectly acceptable theory to me, that you would take these methods of vaulting, which even in Aachen Cathedral and Byzantine structures, there's nothing quite so grand and audacious, so I think it could be Norsemen coming in and then taking their subjects' expertise in wood or in stone building and turning it to these fantastic uses, and it's only really slightly later than this that you get the genesis of Gothic architecture, which we could talk about, but you might want to wait until we get to about 1100, I'd say.
Yes, just to buttress your point. Yes, we're talking around 1,000 monasteries
with flying buttresses, maybe.
Yes, precisely. In terms of the extension of this independent monastic movement, free of the oversight of a feudal patron, but they're also responsible for organizing pilgrimages to the Holy Land, which will become a staple feature after the 12th century. And as you mentioned, the rich art style. Just to give you a flavor, we see the origins of gold altar vessels. We see the arrival of stained glass. We see the beginnings of what we later known as, the Western choral tradition in music, and as you of course mentioned, the Romanesque style as emanating from this. All of this begins the Cluniac movement, which of course goes through its heyday, beginning in the 10th century, reaching its zenith towards the beginning of the 12th century, and then
the abbey, the Abbey of Cluny itself. I think it was destroyed in the Revolution, or perhaps slightly just after the Revolution, or just before rather. But it was a huge building. The descriptions that we have of it almost beggar belief, and you think to yourself, if you were a commoner or just someone at this time, and you walk inside here, and some of the things that were set up, some of the luxury. I believe I don't know if it was the Abbey of Cluny or if it was one of the slightly later churches that was built, but there was a 20-foot tall cast bronze candlestick with 7 candles, and then it was covered in gold foil. And it's just a masterpiece of casting. And it gives you the idea of the sort of craftsmanship that was going on here, and you see the input of so many different influences. You see the Byzantine and the Romanesque, and then you see the northern influence with these new ceilings, and you see all these things coming together for the first time in the genesis of what most people really think of as medieval culture, right? Before this, when you look at the Franks and stuff, of course we are in the Middle Ages, but really this is how do I say, a Germanic culture. It's a warrior culture. It's the legacy of the sort of barbarous era following the Roman Empire, right? And it's at this time that we begin to see so many of the things that come later, like the ideas of chivalry and courtly love and the Gothic style and all these things which are so emblematic of the medieval, the high Middle Ages, all have their genesis here.
Yes, and you mentioned peace again for the church, again to try and stop all these private armies and private wars being waged. Of course, the church is able to maintain its independence, but in terms of actually becoming a political power which can actually affect this, of course, that has to rely on the king. And the king, in contrast to this flowering of what you can say is the great Thor in the Dark Ages, the origin of the medieval culture and the blossoming Western civilization, which had hitherto really only existed in the East, we see a complete collapse of centralized royal authority, which, especially throughout the 11th century, is almost entirely lacking and will only begin to emerge in the 12th century. So just to go back to the House of Capet, to prevent the usurpation, and this is where we have the creation of a dynasty, Hugh Capet elevates his eldest son, Robert, immediately to become his co-ruler, therefore easily succeeding him in 996.
Yes, he literally. I think the excuse is that he's going to go on a raid into Spain, and so he wants another king at home for the security of the realm. But really, it's clearly he's trying to break this elective cycle.
Yes, but again, that also has credibility. The idea, like a Roman emperor, you're also setting up a military colleague as well, because
of course, but it's very convenient as well. Yeah.
Yes,
he was a clever man.
Precisely. And so from this, Robert II is one of the more effective kings. He's able to exert control over Burgundy. And really, in terms of the expanding of the royal domain, as you can see, all of these, independent fiefdoms, they can't just be seized and annexed by the King of France without cause. So Robert II waits around for these various titles to become vacant, and therefore, in theory, they should return back to the crown because the king is the source of all sovereignty in the kingdom. But in reality, this obviously led to contentions and wars, one of which, of course, was over the title of Burgundy, where Robert II would fight for over a decade, trying to ensure that he would be able to take over Burgundy, and with it massively expand the royal domains. And of course, the other depressing factor of this as well, if you're trying to establish a centralized royal dynasty in France, is that once you have got anywhere in terms of establishing a respectable sized dynasty, the younger sons who are going to be cut out of the inheritance demand the system of appanage, whereby you grant a younger son again, a form of lesser possession. And you're going to see this repeatedly happen throughout the history of the French monarchy, all the way up until the end of the medieval era. Where
I think part of the reason why there's probably such a strong desire is because there's such a strong history of literally dividing the kingdoms, right? You divide the kingdom three ways amongst your sons or what have you.
I think more so than this. This is you can say this wasn't premeditated. This was very much an attempt, to stave off direct rebellion from a son. And of course, when it comes to Henry II and it comes to the English possessions in France, it's the exact same thing again. It's these sons competing over the various claims and wanting to hold on to their own feudal possession, which they can earn an income in particularly. So this unravels the reign of Robert II, and under his son Henry I of France, we basically have the lowest ebb of the French dynasty. He surrenders his father's gain in Burgundy by bequeathing it to his brother, again, to avoid a civil war. And one of his, probably only notable acts as king. I think also interesting to note that these early Capetian kings, with the exception of Hugh Capet himself, ruled for a very long time, which, despite their lack of authority, actually allows some sort of continuity and stability, albeit, the French kings not being very effective themselves to be able to, act on that longevity and bring about.
And also, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was just gonna come back to what you were saying about the Crusades and perhaps speak about some of the influences there, because we're moving into the period now, 1000s, mid 1000s, where we are at the cross point between the Romanesque architecture that had really taken off with the Normans, and the true Gothic of the 1200s, places like Chartres Cathedral.
Could I just hold you there for a couple of minutes whilst I just finish off this, because we're getting to that very quickly. One of the things that Henry is, of course, responsible for is actually helping William the Bastard to shore up his position in the Duchy of Normandy in 1047, something which is going to have dire consequences for the French monarchy later down the line.
Why does he do that?
Because essentially he's technically a loyal vassal of the Crown of France, and so invariably what you're trying to do as a French king, you're trying to establish a grateful or a loyal vassal.
So and avoid civil war.
Avoid civil war, constantly avoid civil wars, and create loyal dukes around you who will again aid you in times of conflict. However, William is incredibly ambitious, and so when we get to the reign of Philip I. Philip I, again, meager additions to the royal domain in the form of Bourges. It's during this time in 1066, acting on that pretext through Emma of Normandy, that William, as Duke of Normandy, goes off and he thoroughly conquers England and establishes a very centralized state there, basically making him far more powerful relatively than the King of the French. And this sets into practice this idea where the King of England is going to become the foremost antagonist to the Capetian dynasty throughout this period. And this goes on throughout the entire remainder of this period of history, and in fact beyond, when we get to the 100 Years' War. Getting to the Crusades, as you mentioned, Columba, the only thing he was basically able to avoid was Brittany being conquered by William the Conqueror as well in 1077. And like I said, the Capetian kings are so weak at this point that they are only able to basically intervene within the dynastic struggles of the kings of England. So, for example, when William the Conqueror, dies in 1087, his domains are split. he decides to give Robert, his eldest son, Normandy, and he decides to leave William Rufus, the Red, the throne of England. And of course, this starts a very long-running conflict, which will actually outlast William Rufus. And it's during this time that Philip is able to just play the two off each other. But again, you're just reduced to exploiting the conflict between the heirs of another kingdom, essentially. That's the weakened position you are. Again, Normandy, having been established as a buttress of the French monarchy, is now basically a knife aimed at the heart of the French monarchy. Again,
yes. I mean,
inhabited by...
It's right next to the Ile-de-France and Paris,
Yes.
right? I mean, they could sweep south and immediately take it if they wanted to, I suppose. I mean, the Normans are still incredibly impressive fighters.
And this, again, in terms of the diminished position of the French monarchy, you mentioned the Crusades. Philip, of course, has nothing to do with the First Crusade. He'd been excommunicated by Urban II, the same pope would call the First Crusade in 1096, for basically, unilaterally repudiating his wife, which, of course, was contravening church law. And it's actually his brother, Hugh the Great, Count of Vermandois, who is responsible for going on crusade. So Philip is again completely outshone by even his own vassals who are going on crusade and establishing these vast outremer kingdoms in the Levant.
Yes,
so,
certainly.
So from that point on, really, we get to the kings who are responsible for the centralization of royal power and the creation of the Gothic style. So getting to Louis VI. Louis VI is perhaps the first time France had an effective, strong king. Really, you can say since Charlemagne, or had he lived longer and had he not had to face a civil war, a king like Odo. Mentioned robber barons once before. What is a robber baron? A robber baron is essentially a feudal lord who, using his weird, awkward status in the absence of a higher legal or royal authority, uses his ability not only to exploit his own subjects, but for example, put tolls on roads, or raid of other fiefdoms. Take a noble, or an important person, take them back and demand ransom, etc. Basically, a system of nobly sanctified banditry,
Yes.
created by these robber barons.
And it seems to always be the case that the weaker the king seems, right? I mean, the less the king can project his power, the more the nobles are going to take advantage. And we see this whenever you have a weak king in France in this period. The nobles will take liberties. They will take a little piece of land. They're constantly being very opportunistic.
And this is where we get the arrival of the figure you mentioned, Abbé Suger, who is really responsible for allying the Capetian dynasty with the church. He, of course, becomes the Abbé de Saint-Denis, the abbot of the Saint Denis, who, of course, is the patron of the city of Paris. Going all the way back to the you can say the founding of Paris proper, the post-Soissons Paris under Clovis. This association with Denis and Clovis goes right back to the foundation of the Frankish kingdom. With Louis VI, we had the first time where it looks like the French may actually be able to gain the upper hand against the English, because Henry I comes in effortlessly, takes over Normandy from his elder brother Robert, and begins this 20-year war with Louis. However, during the reign of Henry I's son, also another William, dies on a infamous voyage back from France, and this creates a major succession issue. On the one hand, you have Louis XVI, who is reducing the robber barons, who is wedded to the church, who is overseeing this beginning of Gothic architecture and the consolidation of the French throne. On the other hand, you have a English king, a very effective English king, Henry I, one of the first great English kings, who is somebody who is now left without an heir. So in 1135, this begins a period in English history which lasts from 1135 until 1154, called the Anarchy, which is waged between his daughter, the Empress Matilda, because of course she was married to Empress Henry V, and Stephen de Bois, who is the elected king of English.
Yes, and of course, do you want to go into the sort of the Crusader influences on architecture and the sort of some of the reasons for these changes?
Yes, what I'll do, if that's all right, I'll just quickly complete my assessment of Louis VI and Louis VII, and that I'll leave you, to go into as much detail as possible, if that's all right. So when it comes to Louis VI, as I mentioned, again, the great military successes is that Henry I tries to arrange an alliance with the Emperor Henry V and does so through marriage with his daughter Matilda. And Henry V is actually faced with the united nobles of France, for the first time in terms of a turnaround of the actual, effectiveness of the French nobility actually siding with their king against a foreign invader. This is almost unprecedented in hundreds of years up until this point. And so Henry V is forced to abort, and Henry I's alliance with the Holy Roman Empire goes in ruins. But there is again a note one must take. When Henry V dies, of course, Henry V being the one of the last of the Salian emperors, we have Matilda going on to marry one Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. And this will, of course, later, the union between these two will produce Henry II, which will later create the Angevin Empire and the great threat to the Capetian monarchy henceforth. And this is where we get to Louis VII. And from here, we can really talk about the Crusades, because this is where France really gets embroiled in the Crusades. Louis VII, in contrast to all of his predecessors, inherits a strong kingdom in comparison with England. England is now in anarchy, and he's already married the Duchess Eleanor of Aquitaine. And, I think it's also important to note that Louis VII was never meant to be king. His younger brother, Philip, was meant to be king, and Louis VII, as is the case with the younger son, is often meant to join, and have a church career. His older brother dies some 6 years before, and this is going to lead, to an infamous quote by Eleanor of Aquitaine: "I thought to marry a king, to find out married a monk." And just to give you a bit of background, as you can see here on this map, we have the duchies of Aquitaine and we have the duchies of Gascony. The House of Poitiers had been around since the 9th century, and by 1137, Gascony and Aquitaine had been united into a single possession under the House of Poitiers, basically giving this dynasty control over a third of France, all of the southern southwestern element of France. And so when the last reigning duke of this dynasty, William X, dies, again, the same dynasty who produced the Abbey of Cluny, Eleanor becomes basically the most eligible heiress in all of Europe. And to make matters better for her, William X bequeaths the guardianship of her to Louis VI, who promptly, ensures that she will marry his son, Louis. And so from this beginning, you seem to have, a very successful, build up for a reign. You've inherited this vast possession, which is going to massively increase the power of the royal dynasty. Everything looks like it's going, going positive for France. However, there are no children born of this union. And when they go on crusade, Eleanor, interestingly, actually joins her husband on crusade. This is the Second Crusade. She goes on there to actually help shore up her uncle's claim as the Prince of Antioch, one of the Outremer kingdoms. But of course, the Second Crusade is a disaster. Yes. The county of Edessa is lost. The Crusaders are pushed back. The siege of Damascus is a complete farce, and this leads to the final breach with Eleanor and Louis. Again, there's been no couple of this union, and we actually have an official annulment, which is agreed by both parties due to the hostility now, open hostility after 15 years of marriage. And the annulment, again, it's a pretext of this annulment, was on the basis that they were two close relatives, and therefore the marriage was technically incestuous. However, really this just represents the fact that the pair was alienated and there wasn't any heir. And to really irritate Louis, Eleanor then goes off, marries, as I mentioned, Henry, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet, and produces 5 sons and 3 daughters.
Yes, and isn't and one of those sons is Richard, right?
One of those sons is Richard the Lionheart. The other is, of course, King John, and Henry the Younger, and another Geoffrey. But yes, I think this is a good time to talk about Abbé Suger and all the impact of the Crusades, and really the ramifications and transformation of French culture during this time. So Columba, just
Sure. Okay. So the Abbé Suger that you mentioned, he was actually friends with Louis VI and Louis VII, and I assume the fact that Louis VII, as you say, was, I suppose, a pious man or was interested in the church life, had been raised for the church life. This is one of the reasons for his particularly close friendship with the Abbé Suger. But he becomes a very influential, a very wealthy man, despite the fact that sources describe him as being a short little man of peasant peasant stock, really, who had risen to the church in this period, seemingly on his own merits, so a very impressive figure, and he has all sorts of interesting ideas. I mean, so you mentioned Saint Denis, who was the sort of saint in the Merovingian period. Well, Suger has a very interesting idea because.
Oh, sorry, just to emphasize, Saint Denis actually predates the Merovingians, but he's a Roman martyr in the 3rd century. However, his patronage begins under the Merovingians.
Yes, no, yes, okay. Sorry about that. But Suger actually, he believed, or at least he wanted others to believe, that this was not the Denis that was being referenced, and that in fact, there was another saint who he believed to have been one of the listeners to, I think, St. Paul's speech on the Areopagus, one of the Athenians, who had written this sort of who had supposedly written this sort of treatise, which the Abbé Suger had transcribed and copied and spread around, and it's really interesting because he seems to have within the person of Abbé Suger, we get a sort of premonition of much of the humanism and the relationship between humanism and art that we see later. I mean, because in this work it talks about these ideas of I believe there's even a line that says through the material the dull can ascend to the spiritual, and so there's this we see this idea of, for the first time really in the Western civilization that's coming up, of art being used to not only transmit ideas to sort of an elite, but this idea that you can use art to raise up the ideals of the people. And of course, some people will tell you that this is just an excuse for Suger's extravagance, and don't get me wrong, he was a very extravagant man. But it must be said that much of the wealth that was coming into places like much of the churches at this time did go straight back in, and remarkable building projects were carried out. He was a fond art collector as well. I mean, he collected all sorts of antique vases and cups, which he would then get his smiths to adorn with gold. He had a giant gold cross built in one of the churches. And he was also one of the patrons of the Abbey of Saint Denis, which we can see here, and places like this, and also there's a slightly earlier church, the Church of Vesile, and they clearly take cues from. You can tell that at least to some extent they've been inspired by what they've seen in the East. Anyone who's listening at home, you can look up the interior of the Abbey of Vesile, and you can see that it has arches. But the arches are made of you'll have a black stone and then a white stone and then a black stone, and it creates this sort of this pattern, and this is something that you see all over the East in Eastern architecture, even in mosques and what have you, and so a lot of people think that this was brought back, the pointed arch, these stylistic techniques were all a result of influence from the East. And there was a wide sort of circle of patronage at this time. It wasn't just churchmen. I mean, you mentioned Eleanor of Aquitaine. Well, I believe it was actually Eleanor of Aquitaine. So Chartres Cathedral, right? What we see today, most of it was built later in I think the 1200s and the 1300s. But the west facade of Chartres was actually built around this time, and it was actually Eleanor of Aquitaine was the patron. And so we see on the west facade, which survives. I mean, the rest of the 12th century structure was destroyed in a fire. On the west facade, in the doorways, there's carvings which are totally different from. So you'd had of course large, the Abbey of Cluny before, Cluniac abbeys, and you have a style of decoration there which gets called Cluniac elaboration, and you see in this style it's very medieval, very simple, very, very fanciful. There are lots of sort of strange, crude monsters, and the figural design is very bizarre. I mean, they're admirable Romanesque structures, but in terms of sculpture, there's not a lot going on. But it's again, it's around this period when you get to the 1100s, Suger and Eleanor of Aquitaine, that we get proper sculpture coming around for the first time. And on the west facade of Chartres, you see pillars, which are human figures, very convincingly done of kings and queens and saints, and you can see that the artist, and indeed at this time, loads of the bishops all over from England and France were buying up antique figures and statuary from the classical world, art from the classical world, and they're trying to emulate it. And it's in the west portal of Chartres that you see the faces. They have these particularly severe classical style, which is much more similar to, say, the Greek archaic period in the beginning of Greek sculpture, where you have this very pure and unmuddled style, whereas before in the Cluniac period, you don't have any of this at all. There's no large figural decoration at all, apart from these strange little dwarves and damned people and demons and what have you. And so we see all of these things coming together at this time, in conjunction with the increasing wealth and stability of the state, and so the architecture becomes more and more elaborate, more and more luxurious, but also less. If you look at the Romanesque architecture, shares many similarities with the kind of fortifications that the Normans were building, places like the Tower of London. And when you get to this period, things are a bit more civilized, I suppose. The churches begin to look less like castles and more like churches and cathedrals, and we also have rose windows. I believe Suger was actually the first known figure who patronized rose windows and stained glass windows, which all seem to be part of this idea of educating the masses, I suppose. Although I don't doubt that there's a sort of, I don't doubt for a second that there's also that's someone like Suger delighted in these things, but I do think that there was a sort of philosophical basis for it as well. And sticking with the same family, Eleanor of Aquitaine's son, Richard the Lionheart, went off on crusade, was influenced by the ideas in the East. And many of these men were. But something that not a lot of people know about Richard the Lionheart is that he was actually one of the most famous troubadours of all time. And of course, again, I'm mentioning that the ideal sort of what we all think of as the classic medieval culture is coming about at this time. Well, one of the key parts of that is the troubadours and the trouveres, who are sort of trouveres are poets, troubadours are musicians. The word means sort of creator or inventor. And these were men who would travel all around. They would travel from Burgundy, they would travel up into the north, they would travel over the Alps into Italy, singing songs and composing music, and composing things like the hymns to the Virgin Mary or to a lady, and we get these ideas of chastity coming through. And Richard I was a great patron of this. He even wrote his own troubadour music. There's actually a very famous song called, because of course he was famously imprisoned in Austria on the way back from the Crusade before his mother freed him. There's actually a song which he supposedly wrote, composed in his time in prison, called Janus Compris, which means sort of no man who is not imprisoned. And it's about his longing to return home and these romantic ideals. And of course, when you get to the century after Richard the Lionheart, you get to the 1200s. What we see is all of these things, this nascent humanism, but also these romantic ideas. And of course, that word is associated with this period as well: Romanesque, romantic. We see these things come together into this entirely new culture focused on courtly love and chivalry. And in the 1200s, this, of course, you might say hits its apogee in terms of literary output with Dante in Italy, who he writes La Vita Nuova, which is about his love for Beatrice, and then of course you get the Commedia, which is about he's guided by Virgil, and then this leads on to figures like Petrarch and the Renaissance. And so all of these things are all stirring in this time, and it's a very vibrant cultural period. Many things are done with a sort of a wonderful sense of levity, I suppose, and it's just so tragic because really, if you look at the history of troubadour music, for example, it really does just stop after the Black Death, and it almost seems like it's sort of put paid to the sense of romance that existed in the Middle Ages. But yeah, I hope that's given people a good idea of the importance of this period for the culture of the High Middle Ages.
Yes, and thank you for that wonderful introduction again to the overall culture. And again, the troubadours originating is rather than the French, a French speciality. It's also a particular Occitan speciality, and of course, Richard the Lionheart, of course, was Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony. So all the more appropriate considering he comes from that region.
Yes, I believe because Richard the Lionheart, even though he was a troubadour, he had a reputation for being quite terse in conversation, and he actually had an Occitan nickname, which was, I think, Oquinet, which just means yes or no, yes and no, because that's how he would respond to people when they were asking him sorts of questions, yes, no, sure, very curt. And so, yeah, we see that there is no sort of thing as a uniform French identity at this time. Not really.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean,
no, not at all.
In contrast, when it comes to Abbé de Suger, he was an unrepentant believer in French glory and French supremacy, and of course all of Europe, not just not just in the vicinity of, as in French dominion over the French kingdom itself, i.e. royal dominion, i.e. French cultural and royal supremacy over all of Europe, including England. Yes. And Suger was intent on exercising the centralization of royal power. And you mentioned the fact that Eleanor of Aquitaine, when she was briefly Queen of France, she was instrumental in patronizing some of these works, such as the early construction of Chartres Cathedral during its early Romanesque phase. Well, of course, Suger was also instrumental in allowing for that marriage, and supporting that marriage. He was basically the political advocate for that marriage, and he was, bitterly resented the fact that it did result in failure, and it did result in the annulment. And of course, he died 1 year before he saw, all of his plans for making the strong French kingdom revolving around the marriage of Louis and Eleanor being unmade by Eleanor partaking in the Angevin Empire, which we now get to.
Indeed. Just one last point I would like to make about the art and how we can relate it. Of course, we had the Cluniac movement, which was itself a reaction to avaricious nobles. But what ends up happening is that the Cluniac churches, the Abbey of Cluny and its sister churches, becoming ludicrously wealthy, and then there is an accusation that they're corrupt. And so then, as a response to this, we get the Cistercian movement. Right.
Yes, and just for perspective, the Cistercian movement originates around the 1070s, so just a little before this time.
And I just wanted to give an idea, because of course the Gothic style that comes, I mentioned the sort of the almost classical quality of the sculpture and the decoration on Gothic cathedrals as opposed to these earlier sort of almost grotesque sculptures. I think part of this is this rejection of this sort of superfluous luxury for luxury's sake. There was this strong idea that if you're going to have art, it must be severe, and it must tell a message that's not playful, And so I have a quote here, and this is from I can't remember where exactly it was from. Yeah, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was one of the major critics of the Cluniac style, and he actually wrote criticizing the Abbey of Moissac, which was one of these Cluniac abbeys. Can I just read this little passage to give the idea of the sort of rejection of this style?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so he says, and in the cloisters, under the eyes of the brethren engaged in reading, what business have those ridiculous monstrosities, that misshapen shapeliness and shapely misshapenness, these unclean monkeys, those fierce lions, those monstrous centaurs, those semi-human beings? Here you see a quadruped with the tail of a serpent, there a fish with the head of a goat. In short, there appears on all sides so rich and amazing a variety of forms that it is more delightful to read the marble than the manuscripts, and to spend the whole day in admiring these things, piece by piece, rather than in meditating on the divine law. And so there's this idea that if you're going to decorate a church, it can't or an abbey, it can't distract the priests and the monks, it can't distract the churchmen with frivolities. It needs to be keyed into a severe and serious purpose, and we see that later with much of the Gothic architecture which comes around, which is wonderful and very decorative, but also very imposing. It doesn't have that same kind of levity, I suppose.
Now, if it's all right, we've got 160 years of history to get to.
So okay, we're done with our architecture. Let's go.
Yes, hopefully get it done under an hour. So we get to Henry II. As I already mentioned, he was the son of Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet. In 1150, his father bequeaths him the Duchy of Normandy. In 1151, he succeeds his father as Count of Anjou. In 1152, as we mentioned, he marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, thus bequeathing him the vast area you see. And again, the left map is the one to focus on here. In 1154, he becomes King of England due to the death of Stephen of Blois and due to the fact that he is the grandson of Henry I through his mother Matilda. So all in the space of 3 years, we see Henry amassing not just the largest territorial contingency in France, and compare that to the tiny dark blue domain around Paris in the north, which was the royal domain. It's actually the largest domain really in Europe in terms of one single dynastic possession outside of the Byzantine Empire itself during this time. So it's, again, a vast European possession. But again, to think of it as an empire, again, is more of a historical appellation, because these are independent duchies who just so happen to be in the same dynastic hold as the King of England. And
yes,
again,
it's in no sense a sort of unified administration, a la the Romans.
Absolutely not. And I think it's also important to note that even the idea of it being an English empire is ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, the center of the empire was not
French.
First of all, they're all speaking French, but also, I mean, again, this is a thing obviously established during William the Conqueror's time, but also the center of administration is actually in Angers. It's in the south. It's on the River Loire. It's not in England. And Henry II, and Richard the Lionheart, of course, seldom spend any time in England. Of course, they're both buried in France. They're not buried in England at the same time either. So this is really, you can.
No, I was just going to say, we also have, of course, and I don't know if it's overplayed. Perhaps you can comment on it, because there's this classic idea of sort of Norman bigotry and persecution towards the Saxon population, and Thomas de Becket apparently was a Saxon and what have you. Would you say that's overplayed? Because certainly, I mean, all the nobles are Norman, right? It does seem like they had it was a Francocratia of England.
Yes, well, obviously there was, as you say, I think Francocratia of England is quite a nice way to put it, in the sense that there was this Anglo-Norman and Anglo-French elite ruling over a Saxon population. But in terms of getting into the details, I really want to avoid that, because that's really a topic for a huge topic for another stream.
Certainly.
And really, we're talking about this from the French perspective, and the French perspective, of course, just going back to what the issue with Thomas de Becket was. Henry II, in addition to having this vast territorial possession, also attacked the church, and he wanted to basically reduce all of its privileges, all of these privileges which have been established, the independence, through the Cluniac movement, etc. And
he wanted to levy a tax, right?
Yes, and levy the taxes. And he believed, by appointing Thomas de Becket, and again, almost in contrast to this persecution, Thomas de Becket was a self-made man and considered basically a pawn of the king. So when the king appointed Thomas de Becket, the assumption was that he would be completely trustworthy and completely loyal. But of course, he takes up the idea of church supremacy upon becoming Archbishop of Canterbury. And so in the year 1170, we have the infamous lines, when he's, of course, in France, who will remove this turbulent priest? And of course, two knights use that as a pretext to go over, murder him in Canterbury Cathedral, after which, Henry II is embroiled in wars with his sons, again, instigated by Eleanor of Aquitaine. Having defected from France, she now, again, petitioning for her sons to take over from Henry II and divvy out the domains. I mean, Eleanor of Aquitaine also has, other issues as well, due to the fact that Henry II is, liberally giving parts of the domain of Aquitaine over to the King of France in various treaties. So, she has again a lot, and she's also, again, as you say, trying to put Richard the Lionheart in a position where he will succeed her as the Duke of Aquitaine when Henry II dies. Henry II is notoriously miserly when it comes to actually giving his sons any responsibility or any wealth, even though he elevates his eldest son Henry to the rank of co-king. He's basically broke for most of his reign, most of his co-reign was.
Is this not young King Henry? Right.
Yes, young King Henry.
Yes. Yeah. One point I would like to make, and I will be circumspect, is one of the main reasons why Henry was so miserly and why he was so desperate for money is because to pay for these wars and to pay for his successes, he had gotten himself deeply into debt with a certain group who would later be expelled by one of his
Well, you can
his,
say, I
his
mean,
successors.
this is a common theme that we're going to see with Philip IV, and obviously this group
Yes,
is the
yes,
Jews,
Philip the
and
Fourth. It's pretty much the exact
it's
same
the exact same story
situation.
when
Only
you're
the
having to.
Templars are thrown in as well.
Well, Philip IV, you can say, is much more brutal in many respects. Henry II, in dealing with this issue, goes much further than Henry II could possibly have gotten away with. But Henry II, in terms of like his wars, I mean, his wars are just really shoring up the position. I mean, on the one hand, he's trying to, as you can see, the actual French domain is cut in two by these inheritances. So he's trying to maintain the integrity of his lands. In terms of really expanding it, there isn't so much in the ways of wars of expansion, so much as trying to, I mean, obviously he tries to expand into Toulouse at one point, and ideally this area in the south, as you can see, the blue area, would be annexed as well. But again, once you've established the Angevin Empire, it's really a dynastic inheritance as opposed to an empire by conquest, even though, again, England is a major military power and, again, completely outshines the French power. And this is where we get to, when things, of course, ultimately turn. We've mentioned the fact that Henry II was, constant war with his sons, and young Henry, who, of course, will predecease him. When we get to Philip II takes over from his father Louis in 1180. And of course, he's, as I mentioned, the first king to style himself King of France, as opposed to the King of the Franks, which has become, completely obsolete. He begins in 1186 by supporting the revolts of now Richard and John against Henry. And this is temporarily successful. Basically, Richard is forced in a position where he is going to inherit. He basically rules Gascony for a year before becoming king and of the
I
United
believe
Empire.
One of Richard's excuses was that Philip didn't help on crusade.
Excuses for what precisely?
For rebelling and for trying to expand his influence. I believe it's sort of part of the Richard myth or narrative that he was very resentful for the lack of aid from the King of France. Although I might be misremembering.
Yeah, well, Philip and Richard during this time were allies against Henry II, and Philip and Richard would go on crusade together
Oh,
immediately
sorry, I'm
after.
getting mixed up. Yeah, that comes
Yeah,
later. Sorry.
would go on crusade immediately afterwards. So from 1189 onwards, Richard and Philip are off on crusade. Of course, Richard almost retakes Jerusalem. We have the massacre of Acre, we have the Battle of Arsuf, we have the various defeats of Salah al-Din, albeit the actual success of the crusade is mired by the fact that he goes through Austria, as you mentioned, in 1192 on his way back to his domains in France, and he is held captive by the Holy Roman Emperor, and a vast ransom is paid for his eventual release in 1194. During this time, Philip II had almost immediately returned back to France after the crusade and had been liberally attacking and trying to seize control of the king's possessions, even forming an alliance with Prince John in a rebellion against his brother to try and shore up and take away the possessions of the Angevin Empire, even taking over at one point half of Normandy. But of course, after the ransom is paid, Richard the Lionheart comes back and undoes all of the gains, essentially, of Philip II during this time. In a very short amount of time, we're talking, 1194 to 1199, because Richard's reign is actually very short. In fact, he decisively defeats Philip at the Battle of Gisors. And from that, we have the famous motto, which is, even today, I think it's the motto of the Prince of Wales, Dieu est mon droit, which means God am my right, which is, of course, going to be the rallying cry of Henry V when he tries to claim France in the 15th century. But that, again, that's a story for a later stream. But again, all of this is undone when we have the death, or rather anticlimactic death, of Richard II. Richard I, during his prime, during the siege of Limousin in 1199. And from that point on, we have one of the worst kings in English history. John succeeds to the throne in contention with his nephew, the son of Geoffrey, another son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, of Brittany. And from here, Philip cleverly exploits the rivalry between John and nephew to undermine the Angevin Plantagenet holdings. And when Arthur is eventually captured by John and killed, rather than Arthur's vassals in Brittany and the areas he held over France defecting to John, they defect to Philip. And from this position, from 1202 really until 1204, we have this lightning campaign, which is very uncharacteristic of the entire period, 200-year period before this, where Philip is able to methodically take the main cities and fortresses of Normandy. And what does John do? He doesn't stand and fight in Normandy. He retreats back to England, basically allowing Philip II to take over Normandy, and with that, the core English possession, which had been there since 1066, allied with England, is now lost. And from this point on, it just gets worse and worse for the English. In 1204, he takes Poitiers, which of course was the old capital of the Duchy of Aquitaine. And by 1212, Philip has established his rule in Champagne and in Brittany as well. And by Brittany, I also mean taking the suzerainty of Brittany away from English or Angevin influence and taking it back into Capetian influence.
I believe even John had the nickname of John Lackland.
Lackland, yes.
Lackland, yeah.
Yes, and he would give up his not just all of his possessions in France, but his kingdom to the barons and the Pope at one point. Given how in terms of his total defeat, and in terms of organizing this, of course, as you can see on this map, this absolute vast gain of the French royal domain within the 43-year reign of Philip Augustus, which is incredible considering the incredibly slow process we've seen up until this point.
Yes.
By 1213,
the English are thoroughly cucked by the end of this.
Yes, absolutely. By 1213, he's actually has a coalition against him. John makes an alliance with various French nobles and the Emperor Otto at this point, Otto III. One of again, this is in the aftermath of the death of Frederick I rather, Barbarossa, and the decline of imperial authority. But nevertheless, despite this, despite being outnumbered in Flanders, Philip wins a great victory at the Battle of the which battle was it? I can try and remember. The Battle of the Bouvines. And he not only defeats Otto, but Otto basically becomes politically disgraced, loses all his power, and his dynasty is dethroned. And John is forced to surrender Anjou itself, the core of the Angevin Empire. Really, you can say from 1214, that's the end of the Angevin Empire. In a very quick succession. Really, it only had been the domain of two kings, Richard and Henry II. With John, we see very speedily, within a decade, the entire collapse of the Angevin Empire, with the exception of this tiny domain in the south, Gascony, which invariably would remain English until 1453.
So you mentioned that John allied himself with the French nobles. Was this because of the sort of centralizing tendencies of the French kings at this period?
Well, as you can well, just look at the map. I mean, the tiny little blue area here and the vast blue area here. I mean, what this war establishes more than anything else is not just that the French kings.
Oh, I see. So the blue is areas.
It's the actual domain of the king. Yes, the direct possessions of the king. So it's more the nobles are quite rightfully fearing that they are going to be completely supplanted in terms of their own local power by royal power, and this of course is going to be a theme we see throughout the 13th century in France, which is the apogee of Capetian royal power. I mean, really, the wars of Philip II established the supremacy of the Capetian dynasty in France after 2 centuries of being almost sidelined, and you can almost say completely eclipsed during the Angevin period by the kings of England, because just look at the red compared to the blue. But as a result of this, English authority within England, ironically, completely collapses. It's not just the loss of physical possessions in France; it's the loss of prestige and power for the English king. So in 1215, Magna Carta is signed as a concession to the barons, and moreover, I mean, this doesn't just extend to France. In 1216 and 1217, Louis, the son of Philippe, had married Blanche of Castile, and Blanche of Castile had a tenuous claim to the English throne. And so Louis, with his father's consent, went over there to try and become King of England. And in 1217, he was, of course, defeated. But again, it shows you the decline in the power of the English throne. That
that they even thought this was possible.
Yes, that they even tried. And like I said, John had actually thrown himself on the mercy of Innocent III in the hope of gaining an ally in the form of the Pope. So, and this is again where we get to the papal contrast with the French kings. But then again, it didn't really manifest because this was towards the end of the life of Innocent III.
Yes, it seems to be a recurring theme that if you're appealing to the Pope parade, then you're probably in a particularly desperate situation. I mean, look at Robert the Bruce; he does the same thing.
So just to quickly summarize this, not only is the French monarchy incredibly powerful now, but it's also prosperous. And Philip decides, what's the perfect way to crown this achievement, to actually go on a successful crusade, other than the abortive crusade I went on originally. However, he dies, and as I said, his son Louis the VIII after having, aborted his attempt to take on England, he goes on the offensive again against the English and reduces most of Aquitaine. He takes La Rochelle, which is one of the principal English fortresses in the south. And as we said, as we can see here, this area around Bordeaux and southern Gascony is the only thing that's really left to English. And obviously Henry III, another weak English king, a long-reigning weak English king who will, have his own Barons' rebellion against him, tries to fight a war in the Saint-Yon region, which is just south of the Loire. And again, it's defeated by Saint Louis. And this is where we get to the apogee of Capetian royal power.
It's very interesting, because we would think, if we were thinking of France and England as these two sort of nation states with a unified administration, we would imagine the English to lose all of their territory in the south first and retain territory in the north. But what we see is, of course, because the French king's actual power base is in the north of his country, the last English possessions are in the south.
Well, the ironic thing is that whenever the French kings overextend themselves in the south, there are lots of pro-local rebellions in favor of the English.
Yeah, that's a part of the history that they like to sweep under the rug.
Yes, and again, I think that's substantiated. I mean, you talked about the troubadour Richard and the Occitan heritage there. Again, this is as much like an Occitan revolt against the French, because as you can see here, we have the Albigensian crusade, and the Albigensian crusade is considered one of the most infamous crusades of all, because it's basically a you could say it's a people have basically called it a pogrom, or even I would say gone too far and called it a genocide. But basically in Languedoc, of course, we have an Occitan population. We also have a Cathar, obviously the Cathars being a particular heretical group during this time. And the Albigensian crusade is, you can say it's not only a physical conquest, which cost the lives of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Cathars during this time. But basically it allows for the expansion of papal authority through the Dominican order, which is, again, another religious order established to allow for the conversion and the eradication of Catharism by the 14th century. We see the beginning of the medieval Inquisition here. And we also see as you can see with the actual physical conquest of English possessions, we see the expansion of the French realm into the south, an area which it basically had no influence over before this time.
Yes, yeah, you do have. I mean, in terms of orders as well, that's just something that we should probably note as well. You mentioned the Dominicans, but at this time we have a sort of massive explosion of all sorts of different orders. I mean, the most famous, perhaps, and the most brilliant being the Franciscans, right? I mean, Saint Francis is 1200.
Yes, can I just with the Franciscan order? We're doing a talk on Italy in 2 weeks' time, and I think
sure, okay.
I think as with Dante, I just want to keep this very French. I know it's difficult, but
I wasn't going to go in depth, but I just wanted to note that there is this sort of intensification there that sort of seems to be part of the growing confidence and the growing ability at statecraft and organization within the church itself.
Absolutely. So, as mentioned, Louis defeats of course, the first sort of part of his reign. Saint Louis is under the regency of Blanche of Castile, who guides him through the first half of his reign, really up until 1251. Louis defeats Henry III, the new king of England, at the Battle of Taillebourg, and this again, defeats all English hopes of restoring the Angevin Empire. And in 1259, Henry, signs the Treaty of Paris, finally recognizing the conquest of Philip II. You could say, again, definitively ending the Angevin Empire, but again, just setting the stage for the future 100 Years' War, even though we're getting into that in the second stream.
So have the English haven't lost, have they lost all of the territory, or is it that they are now accepting vassal status?
Well, they were always technically vassals, as long as they hold territories in France. Yes, as long as they hold territories in France, they are technically vassals. And as is the case with many rebellious feudal vassals, that intermittently at war. With this treaty, it is the recognition that the French are basically the dynastic rulers of these former territories, and that the English, as vassals of the French, have no claim over these territories as being vassals of the French king. And of course, the English will pay homage to as vassals of the French king again under the reign of Edward I, when he again makes peace with Philip IV in 1303.
Yes, you have the truce. Yes.
So yes, when it comes to Louis's reign, I mean, really, it's a golden age in terms of the economy is growing. The political position of the Capetian monarchy is at its peak. I mean, and again, it's also due to the strength and the great piety and strength of character of Louis, where he was basically considered the primus inter pares of European monarchs at this time. I mean, especially after his. I mean, the wonderful thing about Louis is that he's forgiven for his military failures in the Crusades. So with the Seventh Crusade, Louis is defeated at the Battle of Amalsura after taking Damietta and attempting to conquer Egypt. He has again captured like Richard the Lionheart, and a massive ransom is demanded, a third of France's annual income, and then he spends 4 years in the Outremer domains, trying to support the kingdoms against the rise of the new major power with the demise of the Ubayyads, which is the Mamluk Empire. But he comes back.
I would also say Outremer, just a little note. That means sort of beyond the sea, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Literally, Outremer, beyond the sea.
Yeah.
Yes.
But isn't it at this time, when we have the Mamluks, there's a sort of the possibility of a Franco-Mongol alliance as well?
Yeah, the Franco-Mongol alliance is a bit later. It was basically Philip was always planning on going crusade. Philip IV, of course, being Louis's grandson, and the Mongol alliance was basically setting up the stage whereby the Mongols and the French would attack the Mamluk Sultanate in tandem, because of course the Mongols had established themselves in Iran as the Ilkhanate, and they'd even formed a local alliance as the Mongols with the Sicilian kingdom of Armenia, etc. But yes, there was supposed to be this great two-fronted prompt attack, but of course it never manifested.
And of course, one of the attractive qualities about that is that the Mongols don't care about all of the great religious sites that the Muslims do. And so I believe one of the Mongol Khans actually offered Philip later, he said, if you do join this alliance and you come in crusade, we'll give you Jerusalem, which gives you a sort of idea of the attraction there. But moving on.
Yes, and again, that's a vast conversation, really.
Yes,
but
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. So go back to Louis. I mean, when he comes back from crusade, bear in mind that Frederick II has just died, and the Hohenstaufen dynasty is being snuffed out in both Swabia, and of course it'll be snuffed out in Naples and Sicily by San Luis's own younger brother, Charles. So we're seeing this, you can say, the ascent of the Capetian dynasty all across Europe. I mean, they would take over Navarre in the 1280s, and by 1310 they would also take over Hungary as well. They would even be elected as kings of Poland later on. But the point is, with the collapse of imperial authority, so Frederick II dies in 1250, the French naturally fill the void left by what is we're going to talk about next time, the Great Interregnum, and become the foremost, not only Christian power, the foremost military power. And basically, this comes during the reign of Louis and later by his father Philip in the form of an alliance between the French and the papacy. So but also just talking about Louis in terms of first of all, in addition to checking the feudal wars, he was instrumental in banning trials by ordeal and combat. With the case of Lord.
I don't know if I support that one.
No, as in to a large extent. I mean, with Duchy, for example, Duchy demanded a trial by combat when he had without summary trial hanged boys who were poaching on his forest, and the king instead refused him trial of combat and trial by combat and sentenced him there and then. I mean, in terms of,
because if the trial had went ahead, he would have lost.
Not necessarily.
I'm sorry, I'm just being facetious.
Oh yeah, okay. So sorry. Sometimes my sense of humor is lacking on these streams. I'm trying to take a very stern stance as I'm trying to beaver through all the chronology here. But
we're trying to get me to shut up.
Yes, a discussion panel where the panelist says absolutely nothing. No, absolutely not. But continue on regardless. So yes, I mean, in terms of like trying to standardize feudal French law and create the king as the supreme justice of the realm, all of these, the idea of the king as the supreme center of justice and the vicar of Christ, all of these or vice regent of Christ, really all of these elements are.
Is this not when you first start to see sort of charges of lèse majesté or however you say it? Like the idea of insulting
Yes,
How
les
do you say it?
majestés, les
Les
majestés.
Majestés, yeah, insulting the king's majesty, yeah.
And this wasn't just, a pretense. Obviously, this was exemplified in the architecture. You've already mentioned Chartres. Well, of course, we have the real completion of the towers of Notre Dame, even though Notre Dame will be completed in the 14th century. We see the creation of the Holy Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, which was basically built to house many of the relics which Louis IX had brought. Because, of course, it's difficult to understand today, but the historicity of these relics is, of course, always contentious. But Louis IX certainly believed that he was buying the literal crown of thorns, as worn by Christ by Baldwin II, the Latin Emperor of Constantinople.
There were
And
loads
so,
of. I mean, I mentioned the expansion of the cult of the Virgin. If you go to the 10th
oh
century,
yes,
many churches are it'll be the Church of Saint Benedict or Saint Denis. But Chartres is really the first. It's dedicated to Our Lady, Notre Dame, and so I believe at Chartres they were actually meant to have had the shirt that Mary had worn. I can't remember exactly where, but it was meant to be a relic of Mary. And so I mentioned that in the late 1100s, most of Chartres burnt down. Well, when it burnt down, miraculously this shirt was totally unscathed, and so they took this as a sign that they should rebuild. And it's in this exact period that they rebuilt it on a grand scale. But it's really interesting. The story goes that so obviously the old church had Romanesque foundations and they were very wide. And so what was required is they wanted to build the new church on the same foundations, but they wanted to use Gothic style vaulting. And this was a problem because the building would be very, very unstable because it was such a wide gap. And so this is supposedly the origin of the famous flying buttresses, which, I mean, if you go to Chartres or Notre Dame in Paris, you see these sort of huge, wonderful pillars coming off of the side of the building at an angle, and they actually support the vault of the ceiling, but they also add a sort of wonderful quality to the building as well, sort of sprightly light quality. And it was a pivotal moment in architecture, in world architecture. I mean, if you look all over, Incans, Egyptians, Chinese, no one had ever done anything like this, and so it was a massive moment.
yes, exactly, and a real sort of leap forward in terms of
A real
European
leap forward, yeah.
civilization. Yes, I mean, on the one hand, in terms of like his religious policies, we talked about his religious architecture. I mean, he basically forbade all forms of usury as well, and this covered most banking activities. Amazing considering the activities of his grandson, and obviously this drove out a lot of the Jews and a lot of the Italians, because of course the Italians were really beginning the modern system of banking at this time, although that's a discussion for a later time. He was also, I mean, in terms of his actions against the Jews, I mean, following on with a papal diktat of Gregory IX, he was responsible for trying to eradicate the Talmud, or the central texts of rabbinic Judaism, from France during this time.
Yes.
So
supposedly Gregory didn't know it existed, and it was brought to him, and he read it, and he said, "What is this horrendous book?" And he ordered it to be burned. Which I mean, if you've read some of it, I can understand it, but hey ho.
Oh dear. Okay. So yes, I mean, on other things, this is during the time where France becomes, known as les filles aînées de l'Église, the oldest daughter of the church, and the idea of the king as the Rex Christianissimus, or the most Christian king, comes from this time as well, as to really substantiate and glorify the French dynasty, vis-a-vis the collapse of the imperial throne at this time, and also in terms of like individual acts of charity. If you're, a Catholic, he institutes, of course, the practice of kneeling, when entering a Catholic church, for example, begun by Louis. He was able to feed beggars at his table, and he would, of course, wash their feet, which becomes, imitating Christ. This becomes a central act of, the mythology of kings, the ritual washing of the feet.
The king's touch as well, right?
Yes, exactly. The idea that and that individual dynasties could, of course, cure individual ailments and specific ailments at the same time. Yes, all of this goes back to Saint Louis. In addition, in terms of the actual sort of miraculous powers, of course, he was a saint, so the assumption then was that he was working miracles. He founds many hospitals, and of course, establishes the Trinitarian order in Fontainebleau. Within his own vicinity, he wants to be surrounded by chaplains Templars, and this whole crusading chivalric ethic, as you said, is surrounded him the entire time. I mean, basically, when the idea, one of his greatest sins, greatest statements, my dearest son, you should permit yourself to be tormented by every kind of martyrdom before you allow yourself to commit a mortal sin. And in terms of setting up the instruction for being a French king, he of course authors the enseignement, which is basically the teachings of to Philip III. How the ideal Christian ruler, the ideal Christian leader, should be an example and follow Christ's example in particular. And this is where we have the sacred monarchy in France really taking off. And of course, this is taken into a much different context when it comes to Philip IV. But this continues with Philip III when he carries on his crusade against the Aragonese, and as mentioned on the Guelph and Ghibelline stream, really you can say the Aragonese crusade is one of the worst excesses of papal power, in the sense that it was purely directed against a political opponent of the Capetian dynasty, which were allied with the papacy, this being the House of Barcelona or the House of Aragon, which had taken over the control of the island of Sicily after the Sicilian Vespers. But again, it should show how powerful a hold the French had over the papacy at this point, that having fought so hard against Frederick II and Hohenstaufen, to the point where the Hohenstaufen dynasty was literally exterminated, and their dynasties were parceled out and removed in Swabia, where basically the popes became nothing more than basically puppets of the French king, even though the French king definitely didn't consider himself as such. But they almost voluntarily entered into this position of subordination after the vast wars of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines.
Yes, I mean, the situation in Italy is so ludicrously unstable, right? I mean, of course, I don't want to try and minimize the corruption at work. Of course, I mean, later we get the Babylonian captivity, which it led to. So I suppose we should.
And without further ado, we'll get to Philip IV, one of the most infamous kings of France, who also very much wanted to imitate his reign on the example of his grandfather.
I see you've used that wonderful illustration from that book. Yeah, I love that. I thought it was great.
Yes. So getting to Philip IV, I mean, he inherits the throne at the age of 17, and his raison d'etre is to strengthen the monarchy at all costs. Basically, is kind of like an article of faith within the Capetian dynasty, that you're supposed to increase the royal domain at the expense of your vassals. But Philip IV really extends this policy. I mean, unlike Louis, who an example of chivalry and surrounded himself with nobles and the religious orders, one of the things that Philip IV of course does is that he shuns nobles in the administration. He shuns the idea of feudalism in many regards during this time, which during the height of feudalism, and he relies on lawyers. He relies on legal minds.
He tries to create a bureaucracy, right? Because you need a bureaucracy if you want to be
a centralized
sole
ruler.
power.
Yes. And the most infamous, of course, of these councillors, these royal lawyers, being Di Nogaret and Di Marigny, and this is, of course, you mentioned already with what happened with England during this time. Early on in his reign, he is at war with the English. Basically, he tries to win Gascony with deception.
Very dishonorable. Yes,
he creates a proposition to now Edward I of England, who just has, as it happened, conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland.
Nearly
conquered Scotland. As
Sorry,
I'm sure
rank nationalism on the podcast.
Yes. Absolutely. So, but getting to Philip, Philip basically said, well, if you relinquish all your control over Gascony, I'll give you Aquitaine. And of course, what in fact happens is that, Edward, seeing this as a potential boon, considering Aquitaine was actually richer in many senses than Gascony in the south, he surrenders control over most of Gascony. Philip moves in and then doesn't uphold his part of the bargain. It is actually due to Edward's own military intervention and again Occitan rebels against the French king, which prevent this. And he's actually defeated in this proposal, and he has to come down, acknowledge English possession over this region. And as a portent for the future Hundred Years' War stream, as part of this peace, the late Edward II, who we actually mentioned quite a lot of time in reference to Piers Gaveston, is married to Queen Isabeau, later Queen Isabeau of France, the daughter of Philip IV, and that's where the claim for the Hundred Years' War comes from.
Yes, I would also mention in terms of Philip's personality. I believe it was a bishop who was one of his sort of rivals, somebody who was discontented with Philip. I believe it was a bishop. It might have been a noble, but I think it was a bishop. He says Philip is neither a man nor a beast. He is a statue.
He is a statue. Yes.
Yeah. There's this and he was also called La Belle, right? He was meant to be a very very good looking man, but there was this idea of he maintained this sort of total emotional stoicism, this sort of marble facade, this aloofness. And I would say that this is not only, I mean, I do think a lot of this was his personal qualities, right? But in a sense, I also see a political play behind it, right? He wants to be this great centralizer. He wants to be the sole power, the divine king. And in order for you to take on that role, you have to set yourself aloof from the people. You know, you're above, you're not a normal man. You know, you are this statue, you know. And of course, and he did have this even though he would engage in like we say, this deceptive and dishonorable act, he himself believed himself to be a sort of paragon of honor, right? And his family's reputation was very important.
Absolutely. He believed that not only was he a Christian ruler, but he was the ultimate defender of the Catholic faith.
The most Christian of kings.
Yes, yeah. He believed he was creating a royal theocracy. He believed that he was basically substituting the power of the Pope. He was exercising the spiritual and temporal authority of the old emperors. He was himself, he was supposed to be the incarnation of Christendom. But of course, as we see, this is unlike his grandfather. This isn't borne out by his actions.
And again, mentioning the sort of spread of soft power from France and the cultural diffusion of France, I would say that we see later with even English kings like Richard II attempts to sort of emulate this attitude.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there was also as we mentioned, the physical expansion of the dynasty, in addition to the expansion of French culture throughout most of Europe during this point. Of course, France, as the eldest daughter of the church and as the center of all these monastic revolutions, was the center of European culture, and of course the center of the Gothic movement of Gothic architecture. I mean, France during the 13th century was supreme. It's only during the late 14th century and 15th century where we see the cultural center of Europe move back towards Italy. But yes, certainly during this time, you know, France was, as we say, it was the apogee of French medieval culture. But of course, he's wanting to expand the royal domain, and so, you know, the perennial threats are, of course, the English. He tried and fails there. So now he goes after the Flemish. I know it's difficult to imagine Flanders because now part of Belgium, or then, you know, later part of the Holy Roman Empire as part of France, but it was considered an integral part of the French kingdom during this point. But he goes to war against them in 1302, and humiliated, he's defeated by them at the Battle of Mons. The Battle of Golden Spurs. And so in response, he launches another military campaign against them, defeats them at the Battle of Mons, and, you know, acquires, it's also important to note that Flanders is one of the richest regions in Europe. And it's also the region trade. The wool trade. It's also, you know, and it's also the region that will give us one of the sites of the Renaissance later on, the Flemish Renaissance. So
actually one of actually one of Scotland's most important trading partners at the time.
And England is actually one of the, you know, the center of European trade in many senses. And of course, you know, cities of banking such as Antwerp and Bruges as well. But yes, he takes over, you know, cloth producing cities such as Lille and Béthune. But again, you know, what's the result of this? You know, he wants to expand his domain and he accumulates vast debts. I mean, in fairness to him, most of these debts were already accumulated under his father, and he actually, you know, resents his father for it during the Aragonese crusade, or, you know, basically referred to as the Aragonese catastrophe, when the French had, you know, overstepped their mark and the popes had declared that a crusade against another Christian kingdom, because it happened to be, you know, in opposition to Charles of Anjou. You know, he inherits a massive debt as a result of this, but Philip, regardless, you know, is always short of funds. You know, he goes to the Pope, Nicholas IV, and is granted a temporary emergency measure to raise church tithes. But of course, these emergency measures, the king wants to make permanent. He wants to use
naturally, yes.
Yes, naturally, he wants to use the vast source of revenue from the monasteries as an extension of his own monarchy. So, but again, it's just
where have I heard that before?
Yes, exactly. You can say in a way he's a more successful version of Henry VIII in this department. But yes, it goes beyond that.
Certainly better looking.
when Philip, we're talking about Philip and his losses, this isn't targeted just against the church. This is also targeted against the bankers who actually loaned him the money in the first place. I mean, when it comes to bankers from Milan and Genoa, when they lent him money, his typical response was simply to seize them whenever they were in France, confiscate their property, and demand that basically they pay for the privilege of being subjects of the French crown, and basically pay off their own debts. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. He has this sort of just, yes, I'm going to do this. I'm totally above you. It's up to me. Yes.
Yes, and this means breaking all of your arrangements. Again, from his point of view, I'm making these arrangements with usurers. Even woe and behold, woe betide the fact that even though I'm exploiting these usurers, they are themselves committing the sin. So I can wash my hands of the fact that I'm just confiscating their property. And of course, he relies on the Templars, which we'll get into later. He relies on the Florentine bankers, the Flanzesi, and likewise, is always sort of seizing their territory. But this goes beyond that. In 1301, he debases the currency, to an incredible degree. I think in 18 months, the livre loses 2/3 of its value.
Yes, it causes economic bedlam.
Yes, economic ruin
chaos.
and riots. In fact, at one point, the king has to basically flee to his castle in the capital in the Louvre, in order to avoid being massacred by the peasants. And in response to this, what does the king do? Okay, I'm going to expel the Jews. I'm going to seize their assets, and again, in the hope that I can accumulate even more sources of money without having to debase the currency further. However, the Jews, in addition to being money lenders, they were also tax collectors. And so the king decides to create an extension of the bureaucracy where he himself begins to collect the tax. And of course, this just leads to the further unpopularity of the king at the same time. And we talked about
supposedly the king's tax collectors were hated even more than the Jewish tax collectors.
Yes, exactly. Well, the Jews had a reputation for being kind of above the petty squabbles or even the local sort of disputes in the region. They had a reputation for fairness. It's one of the reasons why they had become, the crown had relied on the Jews in order to accumulate taxes. But Philip had removed them, in order to seize their assets. But however, now in that position, he was unable to repeat their success, ironically enough. So actually, after his death, the Jews are brought back in to fulfill that function. So this effort to again strengthen and create a royal bureaucracy is very temporary, only during the latter reign of Philip IV. But as we said, you can say this escalating series of conflicts with all of these groups, just goes from bad for worse. We mentioned the fact that the popes were allied to the French monarchy, and they certainly were up until a point. In 1297, Boniface VIII declares Louis IX a saint, and therefore, Louis IX, you basically have this strengthening of the idea of Rex Christianismus and the pedigree of the French kings. However, shortly afterwards, we have, of course, the conflicts revolving around the king raiding church finances. And in response to this, the king actually summons a council of all the basically the bourgeoisie, the Bürgerliche in Paris and various cities, and tries to denounce the church. And in response, Boniface VIII, if anyone's interested, we've actually gone over this papal encyclical Unum Sanctum, composed in 1302. Again, a very cogent response and argument for papal supremacy over temporal and spiritual realms in our stream on the Empire of Christendom. But what does this do? Boniface isn't in a position a temporal position to advocate for papal supremacy, given the weakness of his position. So Philip, as basically a thug, in 1303, sends for de Nogaret to actually physically arrest the Pope. They capture him, they beat him, and he soon dies of his injuries, which is incredible to think that. And to make it worse, when Clement V becomes basically the French puppet Pope, Clement V, who again moves the court to Avignon, and we have here the image in the center, the papal residence in Avignon. Clement V actually organizes a posthumous trial for Boniface VIII, and
yes, the famous trial,
yes, and de Nogaret is exonerated, and Boniface is accused posthumously. Oh, it's fine because he was a heretic and a sodomite.
What do they call it again? They call it like the cadaver trial or something.
Yeah, something like that. But the point is, this is actually setting another trend of Philip IV's reign, where when he removes his political rivals, he actually creates this air of sanctity by which he's not only destroying their physical presence and seizing their assets, and in the case of the Pope, as you mentioned, Columba, taking the Avignon Papacy and the period of Babylonian captivity, he's also destroying their moral reputation as well. Basically, damnatio in memoria. Is the idea of damnation of memory, essentially. And this, the most famous example of this during Philip IV's reign, is extended to the Knights Templars. And just for a little bit of context, when we talk about the Knights Templars, the Knights Templars were founded, obviously, I'm sure most people in the chat have some sort of familiarity with them, but they were founded shortly after the First Crusade in 1119, and they were headquartered, of course, in Jerusalem, and they received official papal recognition in 1139 by Pope Innocent II, and basically the order was active for some 280 years. However, the Templars became, a massive charity. They basically became a massive corporation throughout all of Christendom at this point. And something like 90% of its members were made up of non-martial officials, even though they were also famed for their martial prowess. They were, responsible for creating hospitals. They were responsible for bankers, essentially. I mean, whilst interacting this vast charitable organization, which so happened to have a military wing in the form of the fighting units, the Crusaders. They also developed financial techniques very early on, building their own networks of banking, because, of course, the corporation of the Knights Templar had, vast assets, commanderies, fortifications throughout all of Europe. And, of course, they were organizers of the pilgrimage as well throughout, and of course, the Holy Land.
Wherever you get a banking network, you also get an intelligence network as well.
Yes, exactly. So you can say it was a source of power within France, which the king had very little oversight over.
Yes, so dangerously independent.
So, and again, Philip, of course, was substantially in debt to the Knights Templar when we're entering the 1300s now. And as we mentioned, they have basically become a commercial asset. I mean, the Crusaders had already lost most of the Holy Land at this point. I can't remember the exact year, but it's in the end of the 13th century that the last vestige of the Kingdom of Acre falls to the Mamluk Sultanate, and basically the Crusader presence in the east is represented by the Kingdom of Cyprus, basically, and that's it. All of the actual possessions in Levant have been lost at this point. You have the Armenian Kingdom of Sicilia, which will exist around this time, but in terms of actually existing as a outtremor fortification, no. But basically all of these possessions are lost, and the Crusades, as a function, have expanded way beyond the original remit in the Holy Land to include the Northern Crusades, the Spanish Reconquista, and of course crusades on French soil, such as the Albigensian Crusade.
So with all of this in mind, then, because of course there are lots of very strong, shocking stories that are told about both the Avignon Papacy or the Babylonian captivity, as it gets called, and the Templars. There are sources by churchmen, many of whom are French as well, and they say things like, I believe they accuse the popes in Avignon of sleeping with boys and drinking and being luxurious and
spitting on the cross as well, committing not only debauchery, committing acts of heresy as part of the initiation rites into the the ceremony.
The Knights Templar were even accused of demon worship, I believe.
Yes, precisely. But I think,
how much of that do you credit?
I credit very little, simply for the fact that we see with Philip IV the modus operandi of what he did to Boniface VIII. Probably again one of the great last popes and one of the great sort of popes in the Gregorian vein. The fact that he was effortlessly, due to his position as temporal master of France, he was able to destroy the man's legacy in order to justify his own position. I think with the Templars, I do see so much in the way of secular authority. He's already established royal authority vis-a-vis the Pope, and basically diminished the Pope to his puppet, basically achieving almost effortlessly what the Hohenstaufen dynasty couldn't even dare to achieve at this point. But when it comes to organizing the I mean, who basically ran this? Guillaume de Nogaret. De Nogaret was basically the Cromwell of Philip IV.
Yes,
he was,
yes,
of course, he was basically responsible. The discovery of the Templars' heresy. Oh, no, yes, all these mystical, heretical rituals. Oh, it just so happens that the king wants to recoup his debts from the Templars. Oh,
it just so happens that the king's deeply in debt, right? But
yes,
but then I would turn around and I would say, didn't the king have a lot of influence, of course, over the papal enclave in Avignon? So, I mean, I don't know a lot about the relations there. Was he looking to blacken the reputation of the popes there? If they're under his control, then
the popes went along with this. I mean, on the one hand, Boniface is already dead in 1303, so this is Clement V is now pope, and Clement V is at the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. He is basically considered historically to be a pawn of Philip in terms of allowing and endorsing the disbanding of this organization. I mean, not only did we talk about the disbanding of the organization and the seizure of assets, and of course, this begins in 1307, and we see basically the arresting of so many members of the Knights Templar all at once in basically like a night of the long knives, and of course all these members such as de Molay, like you can see here, who was actually a member of the Capetian dynasty himself, were tortured, accused of heresy, and under torture admitted their heresy, except with Molay. He recanted, towards, just before his burning, and then he was in fact burnt at the stake. Of course, heresy, burning being the traditional way of dispatching with heretics. So again, I just see this as one of the massive power and asset grab by the King of France, knowing that he had
propaganda campaign.
Yes, and a propaganda campaign all at once, knowing that he had complete control virtually of the papacy during this time, and that he could rely on Clement V as because at the same time that Clement V was organizing the trial of the Templars, he had also pronounced Boniface VIII to be a heretic and a sodomite. So all of these things were coinciding around the same time. So we're talking about 1307 to 1313, and I mean, in terms of like you could say the lore and the mystery surrounding this. Of course, the idea is that as a result of this, all these ungodly acts Philip IV committed, that he would succumb to terrible disease and basically die, along with all of the people responsible for perpetrating this. And duly, Clement V died very quickly afterwards. And so did Philip IV, relatively young age of 46 in 1314. There's one thing we're leaving out of this, which is the Tour de Nesle affair, which is the really the end point of Philip IV's reign. The reason I want to end it before then is because that really leads on to the 100 Years War.
It's a good link into it next.
It's a good link in. But yes, in terms of exercising this, Philip IV using all of these, I mean, you can say despicable means, the pure power and the propaganda machine of the bureaucracy, as orchestrated by de Nogaret. He had been responsible for the death of one pope, the destruction of the foremost religious order in Europe, and the subjugation of the papacy. And basically, you can say again this modus operandi with Edward. How did he want to take over Gascony? He tried to do it through treachery. Basically, I see this as
he also blackened the reputation of the papacy in an extremely damaging way. I mean, even
exactly
today, I mean, you still have people like you still have a lot, and I have no anger with the Orthodox, but many Orthodox people will cite the Avignon Papacy as like, boom, look, this is why Catholics are all evil or whatever, and they don't understand the historical context. I mean, I could make many critiques about the acts of their patriarchs in certain historical contexts as well. But I don't want to cause a feud. But.
Yes, we're reliving the schism again over here. But
well, we're due it.
Yes, but I think but I think the point is that Philip IV aspired mostly to emulate the spirit of of Louis IX. However, in the actual acts that he committed, he basically saw himself as a holy monarch, as you said, a statue basically removed from the affairs of men, basically, Christ's vice regent, the idea that he was the supreme personification of Christendom. However, just compare his manner with the manner of Louis IX. How Louis IX actually Louis IX dined with peasants, how he actually went on crusade twice. I mean, he would die, of course, we didn't mention, he would die on crusade, outside of Tunis in 1270. Philip IV basically believed that all of these things could be reconciled had he gone on a crusade, had he had a chance to redeem himself. But of course, he died just before he could go on crusade, like Philip II. So all of these acts, he committed against the church, and as we said, intentionally damaged the reputation of the church, so he could achieve the mastery of the French monarchy over the papacy. In addition, I mean, he not only wanted mastery of the papacy, he was even petitioning to have a Capetian sit on the imperial throne at the same time, really rounding up all of the thrones of Europe under Capetian dominance and the dominance of the French king. But as we talk about when we revisit France in episode 10 of this series, all of this unravels during the reigns of his successors, and
pride before the fall.
And the dynasty will be very short-lived after this. So, unless do you have like a final point to make before we get to super chats?
No, I think we've done a good job.
Okay, I'll just take me a second to get the things up. Nothing on the Templars at all?
No, I'm not an expert on the Templars. I couldn't say. All I know is that they got their start protecting the pilgrim roads, basically, and doesn't the word hospital come from a particular order as well? The Hospitaller.
Yeah. Yes, and someone mentioned, of course, the Hospitaller would be set up in rows, but yes, that's more sort of related to the Francocratio. I don't sort of consider the Francocratio really to be the Levantine outtrimmer.
Well, what about the Knights of Malta?
The Knights of Malta are the Knights Hospitaller. They just move from Rhodes to Malta. Oh no, it's fine. Okay, John Boy for $10. Thank you very much. I'd be very pleased if you could cover the Arthurian romance and its place in our cultural history at some time. Okay, well, as it comes to like a specific stream on Arthurian romance, I'm not sure about that. I hate to sort of make so many promises, but I do very much intend to do a stream between 410 and 1485, talking about the Dark Ages and the medieval history of Britain and England. But I'm not sure when that'll be. Hopefully I'll do it soonish. But as with many of these things, I mean, just talking about this series in particular, I mean, we're only about a third of the way through France. We're barely there. So I don't want to promise all of these things will be imminent, but certainly.
But I will say, in the next episode that we do, that period, we do get the sort of the beginning of the popularization of these cycles, right? Chrétien de Troyes and what have you. So we might be able to touch on it briefly, but who knows? Maybe a subject for a heterodox one day. I don't know. No promises.
Sure. And that's the only super chat. So without further ado, I just want to, again, thank you so much to my patrons. If you have any interest in donating to the channel, there is a link in the description. So thank you very much for my patrons again. Columba, anything you would like to say before we depart?
No, this has been a really fun one. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening. Thank you again, Columba, for being such a wonderful guest. If I have cut out a couple of times during the stream, my internet is slowly on the decline over here. I'm not quite sure what to do about it.
The FBI is trying to shut you down.
Yes, other than, well, I was thinking the only sort of solution to this is move, but I think that's more of a long-term solution than a short-term solution. So hopefully it will be better next time. Anyway, good night.
Good night.